Hi, and welcome to the WP Quickies series, bite-sized WordPress tips and tricks in 30 minutes or less. Today I'll be looking at the humble yet powerful WordPress settings file, the wp-config.php file. Please leave a comment below. Let me know who's watching and where you're from, as well as any questions you have as we go through today's quickie. Okay, let me just get the next slide up. If you're watching on YouTube, if you can click on the subscribe button down below and ding that bell, and you'll get notified of some new posts that I do. And also if you're on Facebook as well, if you click on the like, because I am broadcasting on Facebook just now, or I should be. Okay, yep, I can see a few people are saying hi. Let me just get the comments. Mr. Meowpoos, good afternoon. Seventh Circle Designs in Dallas, Texas. You're one of our regular viewers over there in Texas. I hope things are going well for you guys over in America just now. I know it's getting pretty close to the election and tensions are high, so hopefully that's all going well with you. Alan, good afternoon, Alan. How are you doing? And Joey from Singapore as usual. Nice to have all you guys on board. Morris, these are all our regulars. John as well. John, you can hardly hear me. Okay, I'll move the mic right the way up here. How's that? Is that a bit better? Hopefully you can hear me now. Paul, hi, Paul. And Asim from India. We've got some from India joining us. Well, thank you very much, guys, for sharing your lunchtime with me. Alex says hello from California. I've got loads of people in from the States now. That's great. Good weather and entertaining TV, also known as our debates. Yes, I've been following the news on that. You've got the vice presidential debates coming up, which I think people are quite keen to look at, to watch. Yes, I'll be watching that one as well. John, you're setting your hat. Okay, that's no problem, as long as you guys can hear me. I'll just move this mic out of the frame a little bit. And there we go. That should be better. Right, let's get on with the show. So today I want to do a real quickie one. Today we are looking at the WordPress configuration file. A lot of people don't delve into this often enough and just kind of leave it as is. But you can add a few things to there that's going to help your life a little bit for clients and for yourself. We've got Maria, not a techie, jumping in the deep end. Had a friend create a website for me and want to learn more, and she's from Sydney, Australia. No problem. Thanks for joining me, Maria. Hopefully you'll get some useful tips out of today's session. Okay, let's jump into it, guys. Okay, so outside media assets, WordPress stores content in the database. And that means that the WordPress PHP application needs to connect to a database server. And that's usually something called MySQL or MariaDB, but it can be any different type of database if you're running things on, for example, Amazon Cloud. So in order for the app to connect to the database server, you're going to need a database user with login permissions. So if you look at the wp-config.php file, and that's what we're looking at today, the first block of code at the top allows you to set the database connection. And you can replace the standard defines with the correct information from your web host. Or if you've already installed WordPress as an app within your hosting, then these should already be set with your login details. But let's have a quick look at them. So we have database name, database user, and password. They should be pretty self-explanatory. So you need them to log into the database server. The next one we have is db_host. Now, that's the machine name or IP address where the database server resides, and it's set by default to localhost. What localhost means, it's a name that's recognized on all computers, and it just means the same machine that you're running on. It actually defines an IP address to 127.0.0.1, and every computer knows that means just itself. So localhost means the same machine that your website is running on. Now, some hosts, they have their database servers on separate machines, So if you're doing a manual WordPress install, then you might need to set that to their own server name. But if you're having can't connect to the database, then you definitely want to be looking at these 4 blocks of defines: the database name, the database user, the password, and the host. Now, the other 2 at the bottom, the character set and the collate, you probably won't need to change them. In fact, I would insist you probably don't touch them at all. And they're just mainly used for people who have different types of languages with different character sets. So we're thinking like Chinese or Malaysian, those type of different character sets and collations. But for the majority, you probably won't need to change those 2 there. So that's the first block of code in our wp-config.php file. The next block of code is for authentication and salt keys. Now, a lot of people don't touch this. A lot of people just leave them as is. But what they're there for is they're there to help secure your login session and cookie information that's stored on your local machine that WordPress uses to log in. So every time you log in on WordPress, it stores a little file called a cookie file on your machine, and it just uses that. It checks on it every time you try to refresh an admin page in the dashboard. Rather than you have to log in each time to refresh, it checks the cookie file for that to make sure you've got a valid login. Now, it uses these authentication keys and salts to hash your password in the cookie and also to scramble the cookie file as well. So they're quite important. So they're used as security checks. Now, Kinsta has a great in-depth article, which I'll post a link to, just about how these keys are used in cookies and passwords. So I'm not going to get into that today. But what I would say is have a look at that in your WP config and make sure it's not a standard block. Try and generate a random block. And if you have a look at the previous code, there's actually a link in the WP config file in the comments above. So there's a link there that you can go to, and I'll just post it in here. And it's from WordPress itself. And so it's a WordPress.org link, and it just generates a random block of code for your salts. So I would recommend you go there if you haven't done that already, generate a random block, and then paste it into your wp-config.php file, just to make sure it gives you that extra layer of security for your cookies and your logins. Just a note, if you have logged in users, if you go and change that block of code there, then it's going to invalidate all the current logged in users and it's going to log them out. So if you do go changing that code, just make sure everyone is logged out first and then change it and save it, and then people won't notice any difference when they try and log back in. Okay, the last bit of code in the WP config file sets up the file path for the file system to the core WordPress files. And the very last part actually calls the wp-settings.php file, which starts the WordPress app booting up sequence called a bootstrap. So sometimes WordPress developers test to see if this ABSPATH is defined, because when you load up WordPress, when WordPress starts, it should set this variable up automatically. So if it isn't set, then somebody might be trying to run a PHP file outside WordPress by calling it directly from a URL, and nobody wants that. So a lot of developers will test to see if ABSPATH is defined, and if it isn't, then you usually display a warning to say, oh, no, you can't run this PHP file outside WordPress. Sorry, guys. Okay, next up. So we've covered the 3 main chunks in the WordPress settings file. So that the top chunk with your database, the middle chunk with your authentication salt keys, the bottom chunk where it has the ABSPATH and the bootstrap file for continuing to load the WordPress app. There's a couple of bits in between the default config file. There's a PHP variable, and PHP, that's the language that WordPress app is written in. So there's a PHP variable called table_prefix, and it's set as a default to WP_. Now, this is the database table prefix used to make tables unique in a multi-site installation. So if you have a look at the database for WordPress, there's lots of tables along there, and each of them will have a prefix and the default here is WP underscore. Now, you can go changing that, and a lot of people did, thinking it was for security reasons, but really there's no need to change that table prefix if you just have a single WordPress installation. And there's definitely no additional security benefit. So you can just leave that alone if you've got a standalone WordPress. The other line down below tells WordPress not to go into debug mode. So by default, when you install WordPress, debugging is off. It's set to false. So that's a good segue into some additional WordPress options that you can add into your config file. So let's go and have a look at some of those just now. So these are not in your standard wp-config.php file, but you can add them in, and it then tells WordPress to do different things. There are times when you're going to need to get information from WordPress or PHP and try and find an issue that's stopping something from working. Really, you're going to need to put WordPress into debug mode. So what you want to do is go in and find that initial WP underscore debug and set that to true. But what that's going to do is when you refresh your website, it's going to tell you all the PHP notices and errors all be overlaid on your WordPress website, but that's really probably not what you want to do. So if you add some extra lines down the bottom, it can stop that. So there's a line called WP underscore debug underscore display. If you set that to false, then WordPress won't show all those PHP errors on the website itself. And then you add another define WP underscore debug underscore log to true, and that will create a log file. And the default log file is in the wp-config, and that's where all your themes and plugins and media files are. So it sets a debug file called debug.log in there. However, if you can replace that same line with an additional line here, and you can, rather than set to true, if you want your own file name for your log file, then you can set it to something like this, ABSPATH, which is the root of the WordPress folder, and then dot, and then whatever file name you want to use if you want to use something specific. Now remember, when we're adding all these different lines to the WP config file, remember to add them above. There's a line that says, it's a comment that says, that's all, stop editing, happy blogging. So when we're talking about adding all these settings, make sure you add them above that line. Otherwise, you're going to muck up the WordPress boot up. Okay. So hopefully that's clear for you guys just now for debug. A lot of people use debug. I use debug pretty much every day in my client sites. So switch it on, get the information, have a look at the debug file, and make sure you switch it off again once you've got the problem sorted, because having debug on will slow down your WordPress website. So just use it when you need it and set that debug to false, and then it won't generate any files or display any errors again. So let's move on. There are a couple of useful links that you can add. Just post a link in there. So when you go into the WordPress settings, so in the WordPress dashboard, you go into settings and general, there's a couple of links in there. One is called WordPress address URL, and one is called site address URL. Some people are a bit confused as to what these two things do. They're usually set to the same URL. So I've written a little article down below. I've put a link in the comment, and you can read the technical differences between them. But generally, your WordPress site URL is the actual file path to where the WordPress admin files are, and the site address URL is the URL, the web address that people are visiting your site with. So sometimes people do install WordPress in a subfolder, maybe /WordPress from the hosting. So you can come into the settings here and change that URL, the WordPress address URL, to tell WordPress to look in that subfolder for the config file and all the admin files. And still leave the site address as the normal URL without that subfolder that your normal visitors will use. Now you can override that in the wp-config file. Some reasons you might want to do that is if your WordPress site isn't working properly, or you've tried to move it somewhere and you now can't get it back into the dashboard to change those settings. You can override those in the WordPress configuration file. So there's two lines down there, wp_site URL. that corresponds to the first line, the WordPress address URL, and the WP_home setting, and that corresponds to the site address URL. So that's the visitor's URL. So if you're having problems with URLs in your website and you've made some changes in your dashboard settings, specifically to these two fields, then you can go back into your wp-config file, add these two lines in and point them to the right area, just so you can get logged back into WordPress and change those settings. And so just again, if you have these in your config file, they override what's in the database setting, what's in this the settings in the dashboard file. So quite useful for debugging and getting back into your website if you're having problems with URLs. Similarly, you can specify a default theme, which again overrides that setting in the database. So when you're in your dashboard and you go to Appearance and Themes and you set a default theme, sometimes that can get corrupt. Sometimes there can be an error, a PHP error, and it throws a blank screen into WordPress and you just can't get back into the dashboard. Sometimes it's useful to have one of the 20 themes, so 2020 or 2019 or 2016 or one of those, just hanging in there as a backup. If you do have one of those, you can always get back into your WordPress site if there's a theme issue with your current one by adding this line into your wp-config.php file. So wp_default_theme, and you set it to the folder name of the theme that you want to then use, and that will override your WordPress database settings and use that particular theme. A great handy way to get into your WordPress website if you have theme issues. Okay, this is a handy one that I use all the time on my sites and my client sites. So by default, WordPress saves an unlimited number of post revisions. So that's posts and pages and any post types. Whenever you edit them, it will save a copy all the time. And that, of course, is utterly crazy because it gobbles up valuable database space. So I use these defines here, wp_post_revisions. You can set that to false, and WordPress will no longer store any revisions, any copies of posts in the database. But I like to hang on to 2 or 3 at a time just in case, because sometimes I make mistakes editing and it's nice to be able to go back 1 or 2 posts. So you can then just replace that false with a number 2 or any number that you want to keep a number of copies with. Similarly, WordPress does an autosave for your posts, and the default interval is 60 seconds. Sometimes that's a bit too much. If you want to increase that interval, the number of times it autosaves, I like to set that to 5 minutes. So rather than having 60 seconds all the time, just up that to 5 minutes. So there's a define called autosave_interval, and that's in seconds. So I set that to 300, which is 300 seconds is 5 minutes. And similarly, you can change the number of days that WordPress waits before emptying the trash. I think by default, WordPress does not empty trash, but I like to clear all that out. So I usually set mine to just 3 days. But you can add whatever number of days is comfortable for you, and WordPress will delete all those files in the trash. And remember, if you've got posts in trash, then that's still adding up to your database. So if you've got like hundreds of trash posts, then that's hundreds of entries in the table on your database. So yeah, get rid of those trashed items if you don't need them. Okay, moving on. These 2 settings are some of my favorites. I add them to all my managed WordPress websites. The first one, disallow file edit to false. That stops logged in users from editing theme and plugin files directly within the dashboard, which is utter madness. So there's 2 options in the dashboard. There's one under plugins, where it says edit, and there's one under appearance, which says edit. And that allows the users to choose any theme or any plugin file and edit the PHP directly, which is utter crazy nonsense. So add this disallow file edit to false, and those 2 options disappear in your WordPress website. The other one, disallow file mods, is quite useful. It removes the user's ability to install new themes and plugins. So again, if you're managing a website for a client, that's a great thing to add into your settings, and it stops them from adding plugins and themes and screwing up your whole nicely managed WordPress site for them. Okay, PHP Memory Allocation. Now, in some rare cases, you may need to manually allot some more memory to WordPress, or really to PHP. I rarely do these settings because it's more likely badly coded themes or plugins that are causing memory issues in WordPress. But they're there if you need them. So sometimes you'll get an error that says PHP memory timeout, and you can define a memory limit and a maximum memory limit as well. But yeah, in general, I don't really use these ones too much. Here's a handy one if you've got an SSL certificate, and I think everyone who has a website should have an SSL certificate now. There's a couple of defines here you can add to your WordPress config file. The first one, force SSL login. Set that to true, and that means every time somebody tries to log into your website, so they use the wp-admin or the wp-login.php, then WordPress will force the protocol from HTTP to HTTPS. So it means everyone's always logging in securely with your SSL certificate. The second one, force SSL admin to true. That means that when people are logged in then to the dashboard, then this forces them to use the HTTPS protocol. So if they do try and type HTTP and do something insecure in the dashboard, then this overrides that and it will redirect them back to the secure HTTPS define for those. I'll go through some of the questions at the end, guys. Thanks for that. I can see them coming in the comments. Okay, WordPress updates. So you can disable automatic updates if you're not a fan of that, or if you've got a complex website, maybe you've got a membership site or WooCommerce website that you don't want updating. So there's a setting here for the config file, automatic updater disabled is true, and that will disable all automatic updates for WordPress core, for themes, and for plugins, everything. It just won't run the updater at all. Or you can leave the updater on for themes and plugins, and you can then just specify WordPress core itself. So this is just the WordPress application, not the themes and not the plugins. So you can tell WordPress not to update itself by setting WP auto update core to false, or you can enable it just to update minor, which is you set that to minor, or to include minor and major updates, and you set that to true. So you have a little bit of control as to how WordPress updates for those. For WordPress 5.5, they've added some new auto updates for themes and plugins. Again, you can't control themes and plugins from the settings file. That's only from using filters in your functions.php file. But if you do set the first one, the automatic updater disabled to false, then that will stop those automatic updates from going through if you're a bit paranoid about updates. Okay, we're getting towards the end. WP Cron. So WP Cron is the built-in WordPress scheduler, and it's not really a proper scheduler, and we'll maybe find out next week. But you can disable WP Cron, set the disable WP Cron to true, and that will disable WordPress inbuilt Cron scheduler. And you can also, if you are using the WordPress cron, you can actually change the interval that it refreshes itself. So I think it defaults to 60 seconds, but you can change that to whatever interval you like if you're seeing a performance issue with the WP cron. Now, why would you want to disable the WordPress cron? Why would you want to do that? Well, tune in next week to find out. Shameless plug from me. Okay, guys, that's it. That's all I have for you. I wanted to make it super quick. There's lots of other WordPress configuration settings. There's many more, but we don't have time to cover those today, unfortunately. So let's have a look at some of the comments from you guys. Let's see. Yeah, so true to disable. So if one of the defines does say disable, then you set it to true and that will disable them. That's right. Thanks, guys. Morris, adding the autosave lines and the trash file period, will that also clear up the historical trash and post revisions, etc.? That's a great question, Morris. The quick answer is no. It just stops them from that point onwards when you add them to the configuration file. So there's quite a few plugins that you can use to clean up historical trash from the database. My favorite one is called WP Sweep or WP Sweeper. I think it's WP Sweep. It's a nice little plugin. Install that, go into your tools, and then there's various options for cleaning out old database files and posts and revisions. So yep, WP Sweep, use that plugin to delete all your historical stuff. Mr. Meow puts, shared hosting can cause memory issues too. Yes, it can. So when you're on a WordPress shared system, then you're basically one little box amongst hundreds on one server, and they're all competing for the server's resources, and that means PHP time, it means memory, RAM usage, things like that. So yeah, in some instances, shared hosting can limit the amount of memory that it gives to PHP, and in some circumstances, not all shared hosting, but in some circumstances, they will allow you to set that value to allocate memory to PHP. Now, it doesn't always work. I know that some shared hosts like GoDaddy, that does not work for them. So they have already overridden and set how much memory allocation PHP gets. So if you put that in your settings file, it's going to do nothing in some shared hosting. But yeah, in others, they do allow you to up and down the memory allocation that PHP gets. Now, it's generally a bad idea, because when you're adding more memory to PHP, the way that most Apache web servers work is they spin up multiple, what they call PHP worker threads, to deal with all the requests that are coming through. If you're increasing more memory to each thread, then that's overall more memory that you're using up, and you might just hit a limit for what your hosting is set up to do, and you might get restrictions coming place for that. So definitely check with your web host and ask them from a support ticket if you're allowed to up the PHP, and just be careful. Don't whack it up to 128 megs all the time. Seventh circle design, core upgrade, skip new bundle, making WordPress core updates only update the core without a Kismet and Hello Dolly. Okay, that's great. Thanks very much for that one. As I said, there's heaps and heaps of different settings. The guys come with another one, image edit override, allows overriding images when editing them. Oh, that's a fantastic tip. I shall add that one to the notes, to the presentation for that. I think that's great. Overwriting images when editing them. That's super. So you guys, I'm having a look here. There's no more comments, no more questions. I think that's great. And we are just coming up for 30 minutes. So yeah, I think we're pretty much done, guys. So shameless plug for next week. So I did allude to this earlier on. So I'm going to be talking about cron jobs, and specifically control panel, cPanel or Plesk, if you're using it, cron jobs. So I say the WordPress inbuilt scheduler called WP Cron, it's really, really rubbish, and it isn't actually a proper scheduler at all. And I'm going to cover this next week and show you how to create a proper scheduler that works all the time with WordPress. So join in next week if you're interested in that, or if your scheduled posts fail, or if your backup jobs fail, then join me next week, and I'll make sure that those don't fail ever again. Rightio, if you've got any topics, there's a link down below the YouTube video for a Google form. Fill that in and just let me know any other topics that you'd like me to cover, and I will schedule those in for the coming weeks. If you want to get in contact with me, hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm at Developer Will. Leave a little note as well, just to say that you watch me on the WP Quickies, because I get lots of connection requests every week, and most of them are just, I have no idea who they are, where they came from. And so thank you guys for joining me. Thank you, Jean, Maria, Julia, Alex, John, Joey, and all you guys. Thank you so much for sharing your lunchtime with me. And yeah, check in with me next week. And that's it. Ciao.